The Russian army is retreating from its positions in the Zaporizhzhia region at a time when the armed forces of Ukraine took advantage of communication problems among the occupiers. The situation at the front is changing after the Russians lost access to Starlink terminals, and the Kremlin itself also cut off the Russian occupiers from the social network Telegram. Z military correspondents fears that cutting Starlink satellite internet would weaken Russian troops on the front line are beginning to come true. Ukrainian forces advanced in the Zaporizhzhia region after Russian units lost communication provided by Elon Musk's company. But the occupiers' own leadership also caused them problems. Russian war correspondents are now loudly claiming that shutting down Telegram in Russia will have fatal consequences for the Russian army at the front, because Russians communicate through Telegram, but the Kremlin has openly stated that they can't believe the occupiers are using Telegram. Like, come on, don't make things up. At the same time, the Deep State Project reports that the Russian army continues to advance in several directions, but the armed forces of Ukraine have had successes in the Orikhiv direction, which is in the Zaporizhzhia region. Ukrainian soldiers eliminated the infiltration of Russian infantry groups in the villages of Primorska and Lukyanivska in the Zaporizhzhia region. In general, we will take a look at the full picture of the situation on the front in this episode. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment under this video, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as it comes in, and of course announcements of episodes here on YouTube. So, today, NATO analysts reported that the fears of Z military correspondents that disconnecting Starlink satellite internet would undermine the positions of Russian troops on the front line have started to come true. Ukrainian forces advanced in the Zaporizhzhia region after the Russians lost Starlink, meaning they lost their Starlink connection. Russia found itself in a somewhat difficult position in terms of operational command of its troops. Any alternative that Russia offers will not be as effective. And now Russian Z military correspondents are shouting that they warned about this after Elon Musk in early February disconnected the terminals that were not included in the whitelist compiled by Ukraine. Well, the Russian army has no alternative to Starlink, and many things including combat command were basically dependent on it. And I should note here that Starlink terminals in Russian units have always operated illegally because they were smuggled in from other countries. They managed to set them up partly because technically they were located on occupied but still Ukrainian territories, and Starlink is allowed to operate on Ukrainian territory. And so the United States Department of Defense, back during Joe Biden's administration, began discussing with SPACEX, the company that provides Starlink communication services, the issue of deactivating the terminals in the hands of Russian soldiers. In the summer of 2024, the Pentagon reported the disconnection of hundreds of Russian terminals, but this did not fundamentally solve the problem. And still, the Russians continued to smuggle these terminals and use them on the holy Ukrainian land against Ukrainians. In the end, a solution was found. I won't go into details about how exactly, but Russians can no longer use Starlink terminals at all. And just for laughs, I'll add a piece of news here that really amazed me today. This is the hypocrisy of Russians. This is the very essence of these people. I'll refrain from using foul language, but this news shows the true nature of Russians. But before I get to the news, I want to point out once again that Russians have been illegally using Starlink terminals throughout the full-scale war. This is something that needs to be noted. And here's the news. Russia and Iran have stated at the United Nations that Starlink is violating international law. Representatives of Russia and Iran at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space Conference accused the Starlink satellite network of SPACEX, Elon Musk, of violating international law, stating that his activities, quote, blur the line between commercial and military technologies. Russia demanded to hold international negotiations aimed at limiting the number of new satellites and clarifying the rules for using commercial satellite frequencies for military purposes. So, as soon as Russians were cut off from access to advanced Western technologies, these technologies became a violation of international law, even though Russians had been illegally using these very technologies for 4 years. It turns out they didn't violate anything, everything was fine. But I should note that right after the Starlinks were disconnected, the Ukrainian armed forces recorded a drop in combat activity. For example, the General Staff's report on February 5 began recording this. It was said that, in general, the number of assault actions by the Russians had decreased by half, and this is where things get really interesting. Multiple reports are now coming in about the situation at the front. The New York Times, for example, writes that, according to military experts, Russia seems ready to complete the capture of 3 strategic cities within the next week or month. In particular, this refers to Huliaipol in the Zaporizhzhia region and Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad in the Donetsk region. The publication notes that capturing these 3 settlements would allow Russia to create an urban foothold for stationing troops and organizing logistics for future offensive operations. In addition, it would give Russia new leverage in peace negotiations mediated by the United States. Experts say that Russia is unlikely to quickly turn these gains into further territorial expansion, considering how slowly its troops have advanced over the past year. But Moscow could use them during peace talks to prove that its advance, though slow, is inevitable. And that it's better for Ukraine to cede territory now as part of an agreement than to lose it later in bloody battles. That's the narrative Putin has been feeding to Donald Trump for the past year. Even though that's not true, and right now all attention is focused on Huliaipol in the Zaporizhzhia region, behind Huliaipol there are open fields. That's why Ukrainian forces have few built-up areas where they could take positions and prevent the Russians from advancing further toward the city of Zaporizhzhia. About 60 kilometers west of Huliaipol, Russian troops are approaching the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. Battle maps show that the Russians are about 24 kilometers from the southern entrance to the city of Zaporizhzhia. But at the same time, the Deep State Project reports that the armed forces of Ukraine have had successes in the Orikhiv direction. Ukrainian forces eliminated the infiltration of Russian infantry groups in the villages of Primorske and Lukyanivske in the Zaporizhzhia region. So it's not correct to say that only the Russians are advancing. But in light of the news about Starlink terminals, it's worth adding that the Kremlin itself, fortunately, is making life much more difficult for the occupiers. As you know, the Kremlin decided to ban the social network Telegram and is now actively blocking its operation. And now, Russian war correspondents are howling that the restrictions on Telegram, which Roskomnadzor announced on Tuesday, will lead to thousands of Russian soldiers on the holy Ukrainian land being left without communication, which, in the context of an ongoing offensive, will lead to fatal consequences. Russian war correspondents insist that, for example, for mobile fire teams designed to fight drones, Telegram has long remained the only communication channel, but the Kremlin decided to block it. But it's funny that the Kremlin doubted that restrictions on Telegram could affect the coordination of Russian troops in Ukraine. And now the Kremlin spokesman Peskov made the following statement, quote, "I don't think you can imagine that frontline communication is provided through Telegram or some messenger. It's hard and impossible to imagine such a thing. But here is living proof of this Russian carelessness. Today, the governor of the Belgorod region of the Russian Federation complained that because of the blocking of Telegram, the frontline region of Russia was left without real alerts about air raids. Supposedly, it was mainly on Telegram that people in Belgorod found out about attacks. In response, the Kremlin said they were aware of the situation and only expressed regret. Well, what can you do? That's the law Vladimir Putin passed. So, Russians, just be happy. I'll leave it at that." Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you found this episode useful and interesting, you can support our YouTubers' work with your donation or subscription through the links and details in the description of this video. I would appreciate any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.